When the Second World War began in 1939, the weapons of the past still shaped the strategies of the present. Fortifications, strongpoints, and heavily reinforced bunkers stood as symbols of protection and military confidence. From the French Maginot Line to the German Westwall, or Siegfried Line as the Allies called it, armies prepared for a conflict where artillery and fortifications would again face off in a deadly contest. The Germans, masters of defense and engineering, built formidable structures that were meant to withstand conventional shelling. Yet, by the middle of the war, the United States had developed a weapon so powerful, so destructive, that even the strongest of German fortresses were no match for it. This was the U.S. Army's 240mm howitzer, the largest field artillery piece used by American forces during the war, and one that left a lasting impression on those who faced its fury. The 240mm howitzer was born from the recognition that modern war demanded immense firepower. During World War I, armies had relied heavily on artillery to break trenches and fortifications. The Allies had learned that standard field guns lacked the weight to destroy deeply entrenched positions. Massive siege weapons like the French 400mm railway gun or the German Big Bertha had demonstrated the effectiveness of heavy calibers. In the interwar years, the U.S. Army recognized that any future conflict would likely involve sieges and fortified defenses. Thus, by the 1920s and 1930s, American ordnance engineers began experimenting with super-heavy artillery designs. The weapon they finally produced was an extraordinary machine. The 240mm howitzer M1, officially adopted in 1940, was a behemoth of steel and precision. It weighed over 64,000 pounds and required massive tractors to transport it in separate components. Its 27-foot barrel was capable of firing a 360-pound high-explosive shell more than 25,000 yards, or roughly 14 miles. The weapon's shells could reduce reinforced concrete bunkers to rubble, and its accuracy was far superior to older siege artillery. Unlike railway guns, which were limited to fixed tracks, the 240mm howitzer was built for mobility, though in practice its deployment required enormous logistical effort. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, these weapons were still rare. Training units worked with them stateside, while production ramped up. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, planners knew that German fortifications in France and later along the Siegfried Line in Germany would demand something beyond ordinary artillery. The Germans had spent years constructing formidable defenses. Concrete bunkers, reinforced firing positions, and interlocking fields of fire made direct assaults costly. To smash these defenses, the Americans would call upon the 240mm howitzer. The first major use of the 240mm howitzer in Europe came after D-Day, as the Allies pushed inland from Normandy. German strongpoints, especially around the port cities, resisted conventional bombardment. Cherbourg, a heavily defended port city, was one of the first major targets where heavy artillery played a decisive role. When U.S. forces moved against the city in June 1944, they encountered German bunkers designed to withstand naval bombardment. Regular artillery, even the powerful 155mm, Long Tom, struggled to crack these fortifications. It was the 240mm howitzer that delivered the final blows. Shell after shell smashed into the German positions, collapsing concrete walls, silencing heavy guns, and terrifying defenders who had believed their bunkers were impregnable. Soldiers who witnessed the weapon in action described its shells as monstrous. The sound of a 240mm round firing was unlike anything they had experienced. A thunderous roar shook the ground, followed by the whistling descent of a massive shell. When it struck, the explosion dwarfed anything from lighter artillery. Entire sections of bunkers were obliterated in a single hit. German soldiers caught inside fortifications often emerged dazed or surrendered quickly once they realized the walls around them could no longer protect them. Accounts from both sides confirm the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. As the Allies advanced across France and into Belgium, the 240mm howitzer accompanied them. Though its mobility was limited, moving one required disassembly, heavy tractors, and time, commanders reserved it for situations where strong defenses demanded overwhelming firepower. During the battles along the Siegfried Line in late 1944, the weapon became indispensable. The Siegfried Line was a system of more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and dragon's teeth obstacles stretching across western Germany. Designed to resist Allied assaults, it tested American infantry and armor at every turn. Conventional artillery softened positions, but the 240 mm howitzer was brought in when a particularly stubborn fortress stood in the way. At places like Aachen, where American forces fought bitterly to seize Germany's first city, the howitzers earned their reputation. German defenders were well dug in, their bunkers camouflaged and reinforced. Direct assaults cost lives, but when the 240 mm howitzer opened fire, the results were devastating. American gunners methodically targeted bunkers, reducing them one by one. Infantrymen advancing afterward often found the enemy too shaken to fight effectively. Reports from the front noted that German soldiers abandoned positions once they realized the Americans had deployed the massive howitzers. The psychological terror of hearing the shells explode nearby left an indelible mark on defenders. The sheer logistics of operating the 240 mm howitzer deserve mention. Each gun required a crew of more than a dozen men, plus engineers and support staff. Transporting the weapon involved splitting it into multiple loads, the barrel on one tractor, the carriage on another, and additional vehicles carrying ammunition and equipment. Once in place, crews built a firing platform, assembled the weapon, and calibrated it for accuracy. Ammunition supply was also a challenge. Each 360-pound shell had to be manhandled into position with cranes or hoists. Yet despite these difficulties, the results justified the effort. Commanders often delayed assaults until the 240 mm howitzers were in place, knowing the difference they could make. By the winter of 1944–45, as the Allies crossed into Germany, the 240 mm howitzer was part of the arsenal used to breach the last great defenses of the Reich. During the Battle of the Bulge, though mobility issues limited its immediate role in fast-moving operations, the weapon was used afterward to crush German holdouts in fortified villages. When U.S. forces reached the Rhine, the heavy howitzers again played their part in pounding enemy fortifications along the riverbanks. German defenders, already exhausted and facing overwhelming Allied firepower, could not withstand the combination of air bombardment, regular artillery, and the massive 240 mm shells raining down upon them. For German soldiers, the experience was harrowing. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal their dread of the giant American guns. Unlike lighter artillery, which they were accustomed to enduring in trenches, the 240 mm could not be ignored. Its shells penetrated reinforced concrete, collapsed overhead cover, and shook the ground with terrifying force. Even soldiers deep in bunkers described dust falling from ceilings and walls. Trembling with each hit, the realization that no fortress was safe demoralized many. The German military had prided itself on strong defenses, but here was proof that technology and industrial might could smash even their strongest fortifications. The effectiveness of the 240 mm howitzer also highlighted the industrial strength of the United States. Producing such a weapon required advanced metallurgy, precise engineering, and vast resources. Supplying the ammunition alone demanded efficient logistics. Yet America, with its unmatched wartime production, could field these weapons alongside thousands of tanks, aircraft, and smaller artillery pieces. For German soldiers, facing such overwhelming material superiority only deepened the sense of inevitability. The howitzer was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of American industrial and military dominance. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the 240 mm howitzer had played a key role in numerous battles. Its contribution was not in numbers, only a limited number of these guns were built and deployed, but in their effect. Wherever they were used, German defenses crumbled. Fortresses that might have held out for days or weeks under lighter bombardment were reduced in hours. The weapon saved countless American lives by breaking strongpoints that would otherwise have required bloody infantry assaults. In doing so, it shortened battles and hastened the Allied advance. The 240 mm howitzer was not a weapon that appeared everywhere on the battlefield. Its limited numbers and massive logistical needs meant it was reserved for moments of decisive importance. American commanders understood its value, and when they called upon it, the enemy quickly learned to fear it. Its story during the European campaign of World War II is one of precision destruction, a weapon used not for indiscriminate bombardment but for the deliberate smashing of hardened strongholds that otherwise would have stalled Allied advances. Technically, the gun was a masterpiece of ordnance engineering. Known officially as the 240mm howitzer M1, it was paired with a carriage designated the M1 as well. The whole system was designed to be broken down into separate loads for transport. One massive tractor hauled the barrel, which alone weighed more than 27,000 pounds, while another pulled the carriage and recoil mechanism. Ammunition was transported in additional vehicles, often escorted by engineers who managed the heavy shells. When the weapon was to be used, crews had to select a firing site carefully. The ground needed to be firm enough to support the immense weight, and engineers often built wooden or steel platforms to stabilize it. Once assembled, the weapon stood as an imposing sight. The barrel, nearly 20 feet long, rested on a sturdy carriage with large wheels designed for limited mobility. Firing the weapon was itself a precise process. The shells, each weighing around 360 pounds, were lifted by mechanical hoists into the breech. A massive powder charge, carefully calculated depending on the target range, followed. When fired, the recoil was absorbed by a sophisticated hydraulic system, but the ground itself shook under the blast. The projectile then traced its slow, powerful arc through the air, whistling downward with a sound that many German soldiers later described as terrifying in its inevitability. German accounts of enduring bombardments from these guns often highlight the psychological effects. While soldiers could withstand smaller caliber fire, and even grow accustomed to the regular shelling of 75mm or 105mm rounds, the 240mm was in a class of its own. The sheer destructive force meant that even deep shelters could be compromised. One German veteran recalled huddling in a concrete bunker on the Siegfried Line as shells from an American heavy battery struck nearby. He described the sensation as if the ground itself was being torn apart, with concrete dust falling from the ceiling and the structure trembling as if it would collapse. The soldiers inside knew that if a shell struck directly, survival was almost impossible. For the Americans, operating the 240mm howitzer required discipline and coordination. Crews trained tirelessly to assemble and fire the weapon efficiently. Each man had a specific role, from loading shells, to calculating firing angles, to maintaining the weapon under the stresses of repeated use. These gunners developed a sense of pride in their work, knowing they operated one of the most formidable pieces of artillery in the world. Their reports often noted the satisfaction of seeing a distant bunker collapse or an enemy gun position fall silent after a barrage. On the battlefield, the 240mm howitzer was often deployed in batteries of 2 or 4. They worked in concert with smaller guns and with air support, forming part of the Allied doctrine of combined arms. While aircraft bombed rear areas and lighter artillery supported infantry, the 240mm targeted the toughest positions: command bunkers, fortified artillery nests, or strongpoints that blocked an advance. In some cases, their fire prepared the way for infantry assaults; in others, they eliminated threats before ground troops ever moved forward. The city of Metz in northeastern France provides one of the clearest examples of the weapon's decisive role. Metz was a fortress city, heavily fortified with concrete bunkers, casemates, and underground structures dating back to the late 19th century and improved by the Germans during their occupation. When American forces approached in the fall of 1944, they faced one of the most stubborn defensive positions in Europe. Infantry assaults were repulsed, and lighter artillery could not penetrate the thick concrete. It was here that the 240mm howitzer proved its worth. Battery after battery was brought into position, and the massive shells began hammering the defenses. Even bunkers designed to withstand heavy siege fire crumbled under the repeated pounding. U.S. forces eventually captured Metz, though the battle remained costly. The presence of the 240mm howitzers, however, dramatically shortened the fight by eliminating positions that might otherwise have held out for weeks. A similar story played out during the struggle for Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies. German defenders turned the city into a fortress, with barricaded streets and reinforced bunkers. Fighting was bitter, with American units advancing slowly house by house. To break the deadlock, the 240mm howitzers were called in. Their fire shattered strongpoints, blasting apart German defensive positions that had resisted lighter bombardment. Soldiers on the ground recalled the relief of hearing the massive guns open up, knowing that the seemingly unbreakable enemy positions were being smashed ahead of them. By late 1944, as the weather turned cold and the Allies prepared for the final push into Germany, the howitzers became more frequently employed against the Siegfried Line. The dragon's teeth, obstacles, endless pillboxes, and reinforced positions formed a daunting barrier. Yet the 240 mm shells, with their high explosive power, tore through concrete and steel alike. American infantry often remarked on how much easier it was to advance once the big guns had done their work. German morale, too, suffered heavily. Soldiers who once trusted their fortifications now felt vulnerable, realizing that even their strongest bunkers could collapse around them. The Battle of the Bulge briefly shifted the focus away from heavy artillery. In December 1944, when the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, mobility became the order of the day. The massive 240 mm howitzers, difficult to move quickly, played a limited role in the fast-moving opening weeks. But once the offensive was blunted and American forces counterattacked, the heavy guns were again brought into action. As towns and villages along the Ardennes were cleared, the 240 mm smashed German positions that had been hastily fortified. The weapon was also used to pound German artillery sites that threatened the advancing Allies. Though the cold weather and difficult terrain made logistics harder, the Americans ensured the big guns kept firing, sustaining pressure until the enemy withdrew. Beyond their battlefield role, the 240 mm howitzers had an outsized impact on the minds of those who heard them. American infantrymen described the ground shaking whenever the guns fired behind them, the concussive wave rippling across the battlefield. German prisoners of war often cited the fear the weapon instilled. Some admitted that once they heard the distinct sound of the massive shells in the air, they knew their positions were doomed. Unlike air raids, which could sometimes be avoided in cover, the heavy shells penetrated defenses that once seemed invincible. This realization broke the spirit of many defenders, leading to quicker surrenders once bombardments began. The use of the 240 mm howitzer also underscored the importance of artillery in World War II. While tanks and aircraft often capture the public imagination, it was artillery that inflicted the majority of casualties during the conflict. The U.S. Army's doctrine emphasized the coordination of artillery with infantry and armor, ensuring that heavy guns like the 240 mm were not isolated tools but part of a larger system of destruction. Their fire supported advances, neutralized threats, and ensured that costly frontal assaults were avoided whenever possible. The German army, with its emphasis on strong defensive positions, was particularly vulnerable to such overwhelming firepower. By early 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the 240 mm howitzer reached the peak of its utility. Fortresses along the Rhine, some of which dated back to the 19th century and had been reinforced for modern war, fell under its relentless fire. German defenders, already stretched thin and suffering from shortages, could do little to counter the massive guns. Their artillery lacked the range to strike back effectively, and air power often prevented counter-battery fire. The presence of the 240 mm meant that even the strongest German positions could not expect to hold out indefinitely. In this way, the weapon became both a tactical and a psychological tool. It demonstrated to German defenders that the United States could bring to bear not only overwhelming numbers of men and tanks but also the heaviest artillery ever fielded in the European theater. To American soldiers, it was a reassurance, proof that their side had the firepower to overcome any obstacle. To the Germans, it was a reminder that resistance was futile in the face of such industrial and military might. The battlefield testimonies of both American and German soldiers provide some of the most vivid illustrations of the 240 mm howitzer's role in Europe. American infantrymen advancing behind these weapons frequently described the difference in morale once the big guns went to work. Without them, bunkers loomed ahead as daunting obstacles, often immune to smaller caliber artillery and resistant even to tank fire. With them, the same fortifications collapsed after a few salvos, leaving defenders either dead, wounded, or surrendering in shock. For soldiers facing days or weeks of costly fighting, this difference was dramatic. One American sergeant who fought near Aachen remembered approaching a pillbox that had pinned his platoon for hours. Once the coordinates were relayed back to artillery command, he and his men hunkered down as the 240 mm guns opened up. He recalled hearing the shells approach with a low roar, like a train hurtling through the sky, followed by an eruption that lifted tons of concrete and earth into the air. When the dust settled, the pillbox's roof had caved in, and the German defenders emerged dazed, waving white cloths. To the sergeant, it was clear, no other weapon in the American arsenal could have produced that result so swiftly. German defenders, by contrast, often wrote in diaries or post-war interviews of their dread once they realized the Americans had deployed their heaviest artillery. The Wehrmacht had formidable weapons of its own, such as the 88mm gun and various mortars, but when it came to siege firepower, Germany could not match the concentrated use of the 240mm in the field. Even the larger German railway guns, like the massive 280mm K5 nicknamed Leopold, were cumbersome, rare, and less adaptable. The American heavy howitzer, while also logistically challenging, could be deployed more flexibly and moved in line with advancing armies. This gave the U.S. forces a unique advantage during fortress-clearing operations. One particularly harrowing example came during the reduction of the Siegfried Line, where German troops relied on thick bunkers constructed of reinforced concrete. Many of these bunkers were designed during the interwar years to withstand artillery fire, and German soldiers believed them nearly impregnable. But when the 240mm shells began pounding them, cracks appeared in walls, ceilings collapsed, and doors were blown off their hinges. Survivors described the terrifying experience of hearing the shriek of incoming shells, followed by deafening impacts that shook their bones even when strikes landed nearby. For those unlucky enough to be inside when a shell hit directly, there was little chance of survival. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers could endure small-caliber shelling for days, but the knowledge that one or two 240mm hits could annihilate their position undermined confidence. Some defenders abandoned bunkers outright once bombardments began, preferring to face capture or retreat rather than certain death inside a collapsing fortification. This psychological edge contributed significantly to the weapon's battlefield effectiveness. On the American side, the gunners themselves often developed a deep respect for their weapon. Handling shells that weighed more than most men, operating machinery that shook the earth with every shot, they saw themselves as delivering decisive blows in battles that might otherwise drag on. Crews sometimes described the experience in almost mechanical terms, focusing on the precision required, aligning sights, calculating elevation, adjusting charges. But behind the technical process was an awareness that their work saved the lives of infantrymen who might otherwise die storming fortified positions. The logistics of deploying these howitzers cannot be understated. Moving one required immense effort. Engineers prepared roads, sometimes laying temporary tracks or wooden planks to prevent vehicles from sinking in mud. Once in position, crews needed hours to assemble the weapon and prepare ammunition. Supplies of shells, each weighing hundreds of pounds, had to be carefully stockpiled nearby. Yet the U.S. Army made these investments willingly, knowing that when the 240mm opened fire, results followed. This commitment reflects the broader American strategy of leveraging industrial power to overcome battlefield obstacles. Comparisons to German artillery highlight the imbalance. The Germans, particularly by 1944, faced shortages of fuel, steel, and even trained artillery crews. While they had designed powerful guns, such as the 170mm K-18 or the massive railway cannons, they could not field them in sufficient numbers or move them rapidly to meet battlefield needs. By contrast, the Americans fielded 315 of the 240mm howitzers during the war, supported by robust logistics and a steady flow of ammunition. This ensured that whenever a key fortress or city needed to be reduced, the U.S. Army had the tools to do it. The fear inspired by the weapon also reached into German command structures. Officers quickly learned to relocate headquarters and communication hubs away from areas targeted by heavy American artillery. Field reports frequently mention heavy bombardments making positions untenable. In some cases, German units were forced to withdraw before ground assaults even began, simply because the destruction wrought by 240mm fire made continued defense impossible. Such withdrawals, while saving some German lives, ceded valuable ground to the Allies and accelerated the overall collapse of defensive lines. One dramatic account involves the fortress city of Metz, already mentioned for its stubborn defenses. German commanders there had prepared for a long siege, expecting to tie down American forces for months. But once the 240mm batteries were brought in, their confidence began to erode. Concrete bunkers that had withstood weeks of lighter fire collapsed within days under the massive bombardment. Command posts were destroyed, supply depots shattered, and communication lines severed. The fall of Metz illustrated the futility of relying solely on fixed fortifications against the full weight of American firepower. Another telling episode occurred along the Rohr River dams in early 1945. The Germans held the dams as a potential weapon, threatening to flood downstream valleys if the Americans advanced. Capturing them intact was essential, but they were heavily defended. Here, the 240mm howitzers again played a role, battering defensive positions so thoroughly that U.S. engineers could eventually secure the area. The fall of the dams prevented potential disaster and underscored how crucial the big guns were in clearing critical objectives. For the men who endured their fire, the weapon became a symbol of overwhelming Allied superiority. German propaganda, which often emphasized supposed invincibility of fortifications or the resilience of the Wehrmacht, could not hide the reality of collapsing bunkers and shattered morale. Stories spread quickly among soldiers at the front. Once the Americans brought up their heaviest guns, resistance was futile. This demoralizing effect hastened surrenders and undercut the fighting spirit of units already stretched thin by years of war. By comparing the 240m's battlefield effect to that of other American weapons, its unique place becomes clear. Tanks like the Sherman or Pershing provided mobile firepower, and aircraft delivered devastating strikes, but both faced limitations. Tanks struggled against entrenched bunkers, and air strikes, while powerful, were subject to weather and required air superiority. The 240mm howitzer filled a specific niche. It was the bunker buster, the weapon of choice when no other arm could guarantee destruction of hardened positions. Its ability to deliver repeated, precise, high-explosive impacts made it indispensable during fortress-clearing operations. In hindsight, historians often highlight the 240mm howitzer as a perfect example of how the United States waged war, with overwhelming industrial might, careful coordination, and the willingness to deploy whatever resources were needed to achieve victory. The gun was not glamorous, lacking the speed of aircraft or the dramatic duels of tank battles, but it was quietly decisive. Time and again, it opened the way for infantry and armor, ensuring that Allied momentum never stalled for long. The German experience, on the other hand, reveals how vulnerable even the strongest defenses became in the face of such firepower. Fortresses designed to withstand earlier generations of artillery proved obsolete. Bunkers that once gave soldiers confidence instead became tombs when struck by 240mm shells. For the Wehrmacht, already weakened by shortages and attrition, the appearance of these weapons on the battlefield symbolized the inevitable, that no defense, no matter how strong, could stop the Allied advance forever. As the Allies crossed into Germany in 1945, the 240mm howitzer reached the height of its destructive potential. The Siegfried Line had already shown how vulnerable even the most formidable bunkers were when subjected to repeated bombardments. Now, as U.S. forces advanced deeper into German territory, cities, fortresses, and defensive hubs became primary targets for the heavy guns. The pace of the war slowed in places where urban combat or fortifications stalled infantry, and in those moments the 240mm proved invaluable. One of the clearest examples came during the assault on Cologne. Though much of the city was devastated by years of bombing, German defenders converted remaining structures into strongpoints. Rubble created natural barriers, and surviving bunkers still posed a threat. American commanders, determined to minimize infantry casualties, called for heavy artillery support. The 240mm howitzers, positioned miles behind the front, sent their shells arching over the Rhine. Witnesses described the concussions as shaking the very earth, toppling walls and reducing hardened defenses to debris. To infantrymen advancing through the city, each salvo cleared another deadly obstacle, making progress swifter than expected. The crossing of the Rhine itself highlighted the weapon's significance. German forces, determined to prevent Allied entry into the heartland, fortified towns and ridges along the river's western bank. Their artillery harassed American bridging operations, and snipers took positions in concrete bunkers. Before the crossings could begin, the 240mm howitzers opened fire. Their heavy shells demolished gun emplacements and command posts, allowing engineers to construct bridges under far less enemy pressure. Survivors later admitted that the bombardment was so overwhelming they could not mount an organized defense. One of the last great battles where the 240mm howitzer left its mark was the siege of the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. As Allied forces encircled hundreds of thousands of German troops, the remnants of the Wehrmacht attempted to make stands in fortified towns. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. With overwhelming firepower, including the 240mm howitzers, American forces simply battered down resistance. German soldiers, many already weary from years of fighting, surrendered en masse once their fortifications collapsed. The psychological message was clear: in the face of such weapons, continued defense was hopeless. For those operating the guns, the end of the war brought reflection. Crews who had labored to move, assemble, and fire the massive weapons understood that their work, though often overlooked, had been crucial. They had seen the results firsthand: bunkers split open, enemy artillery silenced, and fortresses reduced to rubble. Many remembered the pride they felt when infantrymen thanked them for saving lives with their bombardments. Though they rarely witnessed the direct impact of their fire, reports from the front confirmed their effectiveness. German survivors, on the other hand, carried memories of terror. In post-war interviews, soldiers frequently mentioned the 240mm by name. Some compared the sensation of being under bombardment to an earthquake, describing how walls vibrated and ceilings rained dust long before the shell itself struck. Others spoke of the hopelessness they felt once they realized their strongest positions could not withstand the American heavy guns. A few recounted the eerie silence that followed bombardments, as defenders crawled out of shattered bunkers, too dazed or demoralized to continue fighting. By the final weeks of the war, the 240mm howitzers had done their part. The collapse of Germany owed much to logistics, air power, and armored thrusts, but the big guns had ensured that no fortress could hold out long enough to delay the Allied advance significantly. In many ways, they symbolized the industrial might of the United States, a nation capable of designing, producing, and fielding such massive weapons in sufficient numbers to make a difference. After the war, the legacy of the 240mm howitzer continued, though the rapid pace of military technology soon rendered it obsolete. In the early Cold War years, the U.S. Army kept some in reserve, recognizing their potential against hardened fortifications. But new technologies, including nuclear artillery and guided missiles, shifted the focus away from traditional heavy guns. The 240mm had been designed for the challenges of World War II, and though it served well, it belonged to a particular moment in history. Yet historians have continued to examine its impact. In academic studies of the European campaign, the weapon is often cited as an example of how Allied forces overcame German reliance on fixed defenses. Fortresses, once central to military strategy, became liabilities once weapons of such power existed. The experiences of Metz, Aachen, Cologne, and the Siegfried Line all demonstrate how fortification-based defense strategies crumbled in the face of overwhelming artillery. For military engineers, the 240mm offered lessons in both effectiveness and limitations. Its power was undeniable, but so too were the difficulties of moving and supplying it. In an era when mobility was increasingly valued, the weapon's reliance on extensive logistical support limited its utility. This tension between firepower and mobility would shape artillery design in the decades that followed, pushing militaries toward lighter, more mobile systems capable of delivering similar destructive force with fewer constraints. In the broader narrative of World War II, the 240mm howitzer remains a reminder of the less glamorous, but no less decisive, aspects of warfare. Tanks and aircraft may dominate popular memory, but artillery was the backbone of the battlefield. The 240mm represented the pinnacle of that tradition, the ultimate expression of siege firepower in an age when fortifications still mattered. Its psychological and physical effects combined to make it one of the most feared weapons in the European theater. For the Germans who faced it, the weapon embodied the reality of their situation by 1944 and 1945. They were not only outnumbered and outproduced but also outgunned in ways that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. Concrete that once promised safety instead became a trap, and strongpoints that were supposed to hold for weeks collapsed in hours. The sight and sound of the 240mm shells crashing into their positions told them all they needed to know about the outcome of the war. In the end, the 240mm howitzer was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of Allied determination to break through any obstacle, to bring overwhelming force wherever needed, and to ensure that the sacrifices of infantrymen were not wasted in futile assaults against impregnable defenses. It was not glamorous, and its operators seldom received headlines, but in the shattered bunkers and collapsed fortresses across Europe, its presence was unmistakable. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, the great guns fell silent. Their thunder had echoed across Europe, marking the steady advance of Allied forces and the crumbling of Nazi defenses. For those who lived through their bombardments, whether as operators or as targets, the memory of their power remained vivid. For history, they stand as one of the clearest demonstrations of how technology, industry, and determination combined to overcome even the most daunting obstacles of war.